Okay, so we're starting off with part two. So whatever. Hold up. Wait a minute.
If you throw a baseball in deep space, will it go on forever? Put Newton aside, he doesn't have the answer here. The actual answer depends on the long-term future of the universe. In Newton's version of the universe, so long as the ball doesn't hit anything or get deflected by the gravitational pull of some celestial body, the ball will travel in a straight line with unchanging speed forever. This is Newton's first law in action. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. But that's just not how our universe works at the cosmic scale. Our universe is expanding, and that means that
Assumption.
a naive application of Newton's laws just doesn't work.
Actually, if you really think about it, if the initial motion of a galaxy is to move through space, then it's just going to keep moving and everything's going to eventually spread out. So we call that expansion. But I think we're naive about it because stuff is moving at different rates and everything else. It's been a long time, and they had enough time to be able to basically end up seeming like they're all moving away from each other. Same initial velocity, no constant about it. But whatever.
After all, if you plop down two objects so that they're next to each other and co-moving with the expansion, meaning that from each of their perspectives, the cosmic
If it's true.
microwave background looks the same in all directions, they will eventually drift apart faster and faster, despite starting out sitting still right next to each other.
They'll drift apart further and further away. Faster? Uh,
So clearly, a naive application of an object at rest stays at rest just isn't true in our universe.
that's for fucking true.
So what then? What happens? Well, imagine that you're co-moving with the universe, and from your perspective, the baseball flies by you. To figure out how fast, you can just whip out a ruler and time how long it takes to cover that distance. But what if you waited, say, 10 billion years? If we believe the standard model of cosmology, the universe will have roughly doubled in size in that time, meaning that all co-moving observers will have had their relative
If.
separations doubled. Put another way, they would now see every other observer moving away from them twice as fast as they were 10 billion years.
Here's the problem with all of that. Is that if, let's say, okay, look, the stuff moving further away as you go further away is a problem people have with the idea of the constant over a distance and then think it's a multiplication factor instead of a really long conveyor belt all moving at the same rate. That's how you should think about it. If there is any constancy whatsoever, but there is not constancy. In fact, there is very many different types of speed that a galaxy, planet, star system can all end up reaching independently of each other, and based off what's around them, that's objects that are nearby that can restrict their movement. It's going to be going slower, and then as you get further away, the only thing else that's around that can do anything to you is the light that's hitting you from literally everywhere. So, whoever's hitting you the most is going to give you the most push, which...
earlier. That is, co-moving observers are separating
Does
from
he
each
talk
other
about
faster
that?
Now, after waiting all that time, suppose you teleport to where the baseball is and adjust your velocity so that you're co-moving again. That adjustment is a boost. You're matching the local Hubble flow at the baseball's new position in time. If the baseball is moving away from your original location, that boost is in the same direction as the baseball's motion. So relative to this new co-moving frame, the baseball looks slower. And as you keep doing this process, waiting, teleporting, then adjusting velocity, you'll find that the peculiar velocity of the baseball, which is the velocity you measure in a co-moving frame, gets smaller and smaller in proportion to the scale factor of the universe, assuming the universe keeps expanding. This phenomenon
I mean, the problem I was hearing is that the further out you go, things are moving further out away faster. But again, if you were to, for example, be on the far end looking at us, the so much per parsec equals a extreme amount of change if you look at the opposite end of the universe, the visible universe compared to our position. So let's say we're here, someone over here is looking at someone over here. They are noticing twice the amount of constant expansion, and because it's a rate instead of a constant, like people are mistaking it for, they consider it to be a multiplier so that every extra distance will equal a greater and greater amount of extra distance apart. And that doesn't equal to actual speed. What is really happening, again, is a conveyor belt effect, where everything, the entire thing, is moving at a regular constant rate, no matter how far you are from each other. So someone extra far away from us would think we're moving light years away, or at the speed of light, basically, or faster, many times the speed of light, depending on how far away you are, if the constant is to be believed. This is the exact thing you're not saying. It is the exact thing that people are completely illogical about.
Phenomenon is called Hubble drag, and despite the name, it's not literally friction or drag, it just behaves like it. As
There is drag in space.
the universe continues to expand, the speed of the baseball with respect to a co-moving observer will shrink until it asymptotically reaches zero. But to know what happens after eternity, you would need to know the entire future of the universe. And for that,
You could think there is nothing out there, but there is the EM field, virtual particles, solar wind, which is an EM field disturbance, and what the hell is that word I used? Magnites? Magnates? God damn it. Thank God I came back. How do you spell magnet? Magnets. Whatever. A typo. Magnets stop in copper for the same reason there is friction in space. Because anything moving and then moving against the electromagnetic field of everything else is going to be making a small amount of electric charge. Now, the reason why stuff is slowing down in a copper tube is because the electric field is also confined within the tube. You'd think it had to do with some kind of effect with the tube itself. It doesn't matter if the tube is touching anything. The magnetic field causing the electric field is itself a type of friction. So there is friction in space. He's wrong. Sorry.
well, all we have is what the data tells us.
Which is something you kind of don't have enough of yet or something. I don't know. But here's the thing. In order for the electric fusion, in order for the electricity and stuff to move and slow down things, the electric field and everything else would have to be a little bit more bounder, and it would be the magnetic field has to actually have resistance with everything else. It's much more likely that instead of the magnetic field, and the copper stuff is a bad example, instead the virtual particles is still out there. Solar wind is still out there. All the light from all the stars is pushing on everything, just like any solar sail. So you can just go out there and experience all the wonder that is you constantly having a kick from the power of light itself shoving you around. I don't care. Good video anyway. It doesn't matter if people are wrong. It matters if sometimes they did a good example and nothing moving in space, stationary, or nothing being stationary in space is the one thing that he got right in this video, with a few other exceptions. But that was very important that you got that right. There are some people who think of the idea of a stationary observer, but there's no such thing. There is only, are you accelerating? And even on the planet, which you would think would be regular, a planet like ours is slowing down its rotation over a certain period of time. So eventually, yes, even Earth is not a same speed all the time thing. But its change in velocity is so negligible, we don't consider it in our experiments when it regards a small amount of time. Anyway,
If you throw a
so what was the other video you did about this?
What happens if I throw a ball in deep space? I mean,
This
like
is part
deep,
one.
like in the middle of an intergalactic void. Nothing around you for tens of millions of light years. The first thing that happens before you throw the ball is you have to get the ball moving. Practically
Okay, so
speaking, what this means is that while the ball is in your hand, you push on it with your muscles. That is, in order to accelerate it up to speed so it can be thrown, you must apply a force to the ball.
that is a standard idea of how force is working. However, there are ways to make a forward force that isn't experienced by the body as a same backwards force because it could be cushioned or whatever else. So even if the ball is experiencing a lot of force and you're experiencing less, or possibly none, because what if it just forces you to spin with a little bit of kickback? Then you have a lot less equals opposite reaction nonsense, which is, of course, real. It's just, it can be controlled and whatever.
And the heavier the ball, the more force you need to accelerate it to the same speed. And that's Newton's second law.
The reason I didn't start with this video is because he didn't do anything wrong in this video as far as I could tell at the time. Let's keep watching.
Force you have to apply to accelerate a mass by a certain amount increases as the mass increases. Put another way, the force necessary to apply is equal to the mass of the object accelerating times the acceleration itself.
Over a flat ground with certain coefficient of friction and bearings and whatever else, all the things, then you can have that. If you start going downhill, a lot of that stuff is gonna change.
You know, F equals ma. But there's another way to think about this too. The momentum of the ball, you know, its mass times its speed, is initially zero before you begin to throw it. But then the momentum begins to change as a result of the speed change. Indeed, the rate at which the speed changes is exactly the force that you're applying to it. Force is what causes the change in momentum over time. But something else happens beyond just the ball's momentum changing. Your momentum also changes. As you push on the ball pushes back on you. And you should have some intuition for this too. When you take a step, the reason you end up moving forward is not because you were pushing on the ground. After all, a force applied to the ground can only affect the motion of the ground. But Newton's third law demands that for every action, like
you pushing away from the ground is you having the ground, if the ground is stationary, whatever else, you end up moving forward because it's immovable versus the other thing in comparison to what you're doing, which is being easy to move.
you applying a force on the ground backward, there is an equal and opposite reaction, the ground applying a force on you forward. And the same happens as your arm applies a force to the ball in space. It applies a force back on you in the opposite direction, meaning that you'll start to drift backwards after you throw the ball forwards. And this law is exactly a conservation of momentum law. Remember that force is precisely that which causes momentum to change, and the amount of force controls how fast the momentum changes. So if for every force there is an equal and opposite force, then that means that every time one object's momentum changes by a certain amount, the momentum of some other object or collection of objects must change by the same amount, but in the opposite direction, since the
Possibly. Again, when it comes to these things, if you have a cushioning system, then those forces are negated, and it doesn't equal the same stuff. Although force was experienced, it's like you would still end up with something. But then the results are obviously different. Like if you have yourself with a spring, then a lot of that is you taking in all of that force and compressing the spring before you end up feeling the full force of the ball. Would you still end up with maximum force as the spring recoils? Well, as the spring coils up and whatever else, you could also have that be cushioned by, say, pretend that you have a cannon. The cannon is in the water. Now, the water is not going to be pushed a lot by the cannon, and it's simply going to splash maybe a little bit. The amount of force to the whole system is going to be very negligible if, when the cannon is moving back, it's moving back with like springs on springs on springs, so that, or a cushion on a cushion on a cushion, so that basically you experience a lot of force for the ball and you negate all forces to yourself. Now then, imagine you actually think of what I just said and make a rocket out of it, because you can just catch the ball and throw it again and keep on accelerating yourself with like the size of an asteroid being shoved backwards, cushioned, and then thrown again. But we're not there yet, because that is a lot of force that you have to negate. And I'm not saying it's easy, I'm just saying it's possible in some amounts.
Forces are exactly equal and opposite. So, assuming that you have significantly more mass than the ball, because your momentum changed by the same amount as the ball's momentum, but in the opposite direction, you'll end up drifting backwards slowly while it shoots forward quickly.
Again, if you end up pivoting, then a lot of that turns into you rotating instead of a lot of it going into your actual full body going backward. So you end up doing a whole spin and pirouette, and then instead you can just slow yourself down with a little bit of a jet or whatever and readjust and barely have any need to do anything else about it. But the ball's going to keep going.
Now, the final thing that happens after you release the ball is that it just goes. If it doesn't hit anything, and neglecting the expansion of the universe, it'll go in the same direction at the same speed forever. This is Newton's first law. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force, and similarly again for an object at rest. Now, this is a consequence.
So, of course, with all the stuff in space and whatever else, we expect it to simply just go out there, and then the only thing that we would expect anything to do anything to it is, of course, something affecting it, which, of course, there is actually stuff out there in space to affect the speed of things. It's just going to take forever for that to actually take effect, because you're dealing with like small little bumps from virtual particles that barely ever interact with anything, much less are enough to slow it down by a fraction of a Newton or whatever, in comparison to the like just their size and everything, and their mass versus the mass of everything else, or other such particle winds or whatever.
Of momentum conservation again. If there are no forces, then momentum is conserved. And because momentum is just mass times speed, if the mass is unchanging, because of course it is, then its speed must also be unchanging, otherwise the momentum would change. So it turns out all of Newton's laws of motion are just different ways of accounting for momentum conservation in different scenarios. They might seem obvious now, but consider how hard it was back then.
So then we have this crazy idea of the expansion of the universe, which is the entire landscape is stretching and you're just going along for the ride, which is what he says in this video.
If you throw a baseball in deep space,
which I feel it's interesting that you can have this statement independent and separate from, like, there's no hint in the end of this.
Again for an so it turns out all of Newton's laws of motion are just different ways of accounting for momentum conservation in different scenarios. They might seem obvious now, but consider how hard it was back then. I mean, Newton was brilliant. Who else could have come up with, if you don't push on something, it won't move?
Or if you don't slow something down, it just won't stop. So the interesting thing about the ball moving, if the expansion of the universe is to be expected, then the ball is actually, truly, going to be going not its own speed, but its speed plus the expansion of the universe, which is forcing everything apart. Although it's not technically moving at a faster rate, its rate is constant, but it plus the movement of the everything else is like it in, if it was a constant speed on a train that is also moving away. And so as it's rolling on the ground, it doesn't stop for whatever reason, but the train along its movement is adding its own speed and motion to the ball's speed. It doesn't have to put any more effort into it, just like the person doesn't have to walk any faster to go up the train and end up with a total velocity of 55 if it's moving 5 and the train is moving 50. But, of course, this is a simplification, and as simplifications go, it's usually not as undetailed as all of that in the real world. So then, what are all these other things? And again, is the expansion of the universe a true constant? Well, the only way to really test that is not by other objects in the universe, because you would have to first assess their normal speed over time, which is like 10 years or 100 years. And then you would have to also, I mean, we have charts from 1,000 years ago. That'll help a little. But the other thing is to know that as we are getting information, imagine if something were to be moving towards us from very far away. What would it look like? Well, it's kind of crazy, because an object moving towards us from millions of or billions of light years away is actually something that, as it's getting closer, it's also sooner. It's not just further and further away in distance, it's further in back in time, but now it is closer, so it may not have taken nearly as long in order to get to the distance that it is now. Or it could have taken the entire 1,000 years in order for it to go from a billion light years away to a million light years away. If it was going like half the speed of light, it would take 2 billion or 2,000 years to get from billion to million. And knowing anywhere in between, whatever ratio that is, we can tell the speed of the object based on how, basically, the only way we know anything about anything that's out there is that it gets dimmer. Now, you have to realize stars throughout their lifespan may get dimmer, or something might happen to them, but we can compensate for all of this and know that it's not just the stars getting older or whatever else, but they're also moving further and further away, which makes them more dim, makes it really hard to see any of them with the naked eye. Like these tiny bits of cluster of stars in here, that's a lot actually, entire galaxies probably, but we see them as only a tiny little fractions of dots. In fact, right here, there's a trinary of tiny little cluster of things right here, so far away, but we can tell where they approximately are in comparison to anything that might be brighter, bigger, closer. And in truth, the further and further you go, you're not going to see things change in size that much. It's going to be a fraction of a degree here and there. So the size of an object really doesn't tell you everything. It could be bigger, brighter, and further away, and look like something that is similar, but it's closer, like anything with the flashlight on the wall scenario. If your finger is closer to the flashlight, it shines a shadow that is clearly bigger than if it's closer to the wall. Do this yourself. Really simple. So, knowing that and knowing how the square light works, you can still, again, figure out these pixels, figure out where they are, how dim they are, how far away the light would have had to be in order to be that dim and everything. And truly know how far away it is, but in knowing that, you also know how far in the past it is. Distance over time, however, is this versus the next bit of information that we get. So if an object is moving towards us, it takes a certain amount of time and then it gets less dim, which is less likely because in the scope of the 13 plus billion years that we've experienced existence as a universe, all things are basically moving in similar directions but mostly away. But compared to in some part of the universe, if you were to imagine it, if everything is moving in some direction no matter what, there would be an idea of something else that is still end up moving towards it. Now, it could be a fraction of its speed, or it could be much faster than the observer is actually moving itself. So it's catching up. Whereas other things in other directions are definitely moving away, and definitely moving away much faster than anything that is moving towards, or say moving tangent to everything, just on the side of everything. Hard to get all of that down, but I'm pretty sure people are just thinking Hubble constant, using it as a multiplier, and instead of thinking of a conveyor belt, they're thinking about something that if you're twice as far, you're moving twice the distance away. And it doesn't have to mean that. It could be that it's just the same, even if you are far away. So for every megaparsec, you're moving, what is it, 70 kilometers per 70,000 kilometers per second or something away, which is talking about like all that. But if it's a constant, they're still thinking that things are moving faster and faster the further and further away you go. And that could be a visual thing, but it doesn't refer to the actual motion of things, because again, as you're going further and further away, you also have to think about it's further and further into the past. So I can't get into all that. I don't know all that. It's hard to get into all that. It's hard to think about because I don't know exactly. Like in 1 year, you end up seeing something move half a light year away, or whatever else. It's moving at considerable speed, but it's not light speed. And then you see other things that are further and further and further away, and you see them as moving even more than a light year away in the course of 1 year. Well, that would mean that there has to be things moving faster than a light year. But what if it's a billion light years away? Well, moving multiple light years away, something that's a billion light years away, there's some calculations you can do for how fast those light signals would have changed going forward. And it's already breaking my head trying to think about how exactly you extrapolate that. So over the course of a billion years, an object that ends up moving that far away in that amount of time, really the thing about time and distance and motion relative to everything else is that if the universe is constant and things are just regular, then the light isn't going to have to take an extra amount of time in order to get places. If the universe is expanding, technically the light would have to take, if that affects light, then the light would have to take extra long journeys for further and further distances, meaning that the actual time and distance that it takes to get to those areas for the light to get to us, it could have been that it was actually a lot less time, which would mean that in distance, light is technically because of the expansion of the universe, in comparison to where we are here, light could be seen as actually moving way faster than it normally does. It's a weird conundrum. People don't like to resolve it. People don't like to really look into it properly to figure it out. Or if it only happens to like the macroscopic items like galaxies and all of that, that's convenient. And then light can still be a constant and everything moving at a second per second makes sense, and you don't have to compensate for that over larger distances. If the constant is the universe is expanding, it's kind of like a time dilation function where you have everything moving away at a further amount, meaning it's not just moving, but it's also taking an extra amount of time to get to there. So something that looks like it's a billion light years away, that light would have had to take a billion years to travel through space that has already expanded. And then given a certain amount of time, if the universe has doubled in that period of time, then the length of time that it took for that light from that distance to get to us is not regular. It's not a standard number anymore because it would have to travel the extra long distance. This needs to be resolved before we have any goddamn stuff about it or whatever. Why is it doing that? I don't understand. I'm watching something. Why would
If
it...
you throw a baseball in deep space,
Shut up. Why would it blank? Whatever.